What happens when Meghan Markle sits down for an interview expecting questions about her work? But Susanna Reid refuses to stay on the surface. The conversation quickly becomes uncomfortable, with questions about Meghan's relationship with Britain, her public life, and the issues she has discussed before. Instead of moving smoothly from one topic to another, the interview becomes a disagreement over what a journalist is entitled to ask and what a guest is willing to answer. Meghan pushes back against the questioning, while Susanna maintains that she is simply doing her job. And as the exchange continues, the disagreement reaches a point where Meghan decides she has had enough and walks away from the conversation. But what exactly led to that moment? And was Susanna being too persistent, or was she asking the questions viewers expected to hear? Here's how the confrontation unfolded. The interview was supposed to be a chance for Meghan Markle to return to British television and talk about her work, her public life, and the project she has been building since leaving the UK. Sitting across from her was Susanna Reid, an interviewer known for asking direct questions and following up when an answer does not fully address the point. At first, the conversation appeared straightforward. Meghan was given the opportunity to explain her current priorities and discuss the direction of her work. But once Susanna moved toward more complicated subjects, including Meghan's relationship with Britain, her family, and questions surrounding her professional partnerships, the tone began to change. Meghan appeared increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the interview, while Susanna continued to argue that these were reasonable subjects for a public interview. What followed was less about promotion and more about a disagreement over the questions themselves. The key issue was simple. Meghan wanted to control which subjects were discussed, while Susanna wanted answers to questions she considered relevant. As the exchange continued, that difference became impossible to ignore. And eventually, the conversation reached the moment that changed the entire interview. From the beginning, the atmosphere around Meghan Markle's appearance on Good Morning Britain was one of strong public interest. Her return to British television was always likely to attract attention, particularly because much of her public life had been connected to Britain before she moved to the United States. When Meghan took her seat opposite Susanna Reid, the opening exchange was polite and professional. Susanna welcomed her and began with questions that allowed Meghan to explain why she had agreed to appear and what she wanted viewers to know about her current work. At this stage, there was no obvious confrontation. Meghan remained composed, and Susanna followed the familiar interview format: ask a question, listen to the answer, and then move to the next subject. But the direction of the conversation soon became more important than the formal introductions. Susanna was not interested in simply discussing promotional talking points. She wanted to understand how Meghan viewed Britain now and whether her perspective had changed since leaving the country. That meant asking about subjects that were already part of Meghan's public story. Meghan's answers remained careful, focusing largely on moving forward and concentrating on positive work. Susanna, however, continued with follow-up questions. That difference in approach would become central to the interview. Meghan appeared to want the conversation focused on what she was doing now, while Susanna wanted to examine the wider context behind it. The interview had only just begun, but the direction was already becoming clear. The first real tension began when Susanna Reid moved beyond general questions and asked Meghan Markle about her relationship with Britain. Rather than simply asking about her current projects, Susanna wanted to know how Meghan viewed the country after everything that had happened since her departure. Meghan explained that she had made decisions she believed were necessary for herself and her family. Susanna then followed up with a straightforward question: what exactly had made those decisions necessary? That question changed the tone. Meghan referred broadly to an environment she believed had caused harm, but Susanna wanted her to be more specific. Was she referring to the media, the institution, the wider public environment, or something connected to the royal family? Meghan's response remained general. She suggested that the issues had already been discussed publicly and that the information was available through previous interviews and documentaries. Susanna did not accept that as a complete answer. She pointed out that some of the claims Meghan had previously made had been questioned or disputed, making clarification relevant to a current interview. Meghan appeared to see the follow-up questions differently. Instead of treating them as requests for clarification, she began to suggest that the questioning itself was unfair. Susanna remained calm and explained that asking for clarification was part of her role. She was not asking Meghan to repeat everything from the past. She wanted to understand what Meghan meant now. That distinction became the first major disagreement of the interview. Meghan saw the questions as criticism, while Susanna viewed them as normal follow-ups. Susanna then moved the conversation toward Meghan's professional work, giving her an opportunity to discuss the projects she had been developing outside the royal family. Meghan spoke about her lifestyle brand and the idea behind it, focusing on creating products and experiences connected to everyday life. The answer was positive and carefully presented, and for a moment, the conversation appeared to be moving in a more comfortable direction. But Susanna quickly followed up with questions about the business itself. She asked about the company's direction and the changes surrounding its partnerships. In particular, questions about Netflix became relevant because the streaming company had previously been closely associated with Meghan and Prince Harry's professional projects. Meghan described the situation as a strategic change and emphasized the importance of moving forward independently. Susanna wanted more detail. If the change was a business decision, what had actually happened behind the scenes? Meghan declined to discuss private negotiations. Susanna accepted that some business information could be confidential, but pointed out that the subject was still relevant because Meghan was appearing on television to discuss her professional work. The exchange highlighted the growing difference between the two sides. Meghan wanted to focus on the positive aspects of her projects without discussing private business matters. Susanna wanted specific answers about the decisions behind those projects. Ed Balls attempted to keep the conversation balanced, but Susanna continued with the follow-up questions. At this point, the interview was no longer simply about promoting Meghan's work. It had become a discussion about how much information a public figure should provide when discussing her career, and where the line between privacy and accountability should be drawn. The discussion became more difficult when Susanna Reid began comparing Meghan Markle's answers with issues she had previously discussed publicly. Susanna's approach was simple. If Meghan had already spoken about certain subjects in interviews and documentaries, why should questions about those subjects be considered inappropriate now? Meghan maintained that she had already explained her position and did not want to revisit every detail. She also suggested that information she had provided in the past had often been misunderstood or taken out of context. Susanna pushed back by explaining that clarification was exactly what an interview could provide. If there were misunderstandings, Meghan had an opportunity to explain them directly rather than leaving viewers to rely on previous statements. The disagreement was becoming less about any single topic and more about how the interview itself should work. Meghan appeared to want clear boundaries around subjects she considered private or already settled. Susanna argued that those boundaries became difficult to understand when the same subjects had previously been discussed publicly. She pointed out that Meghan had spoken openly about her experiences with the royal family, the media, and other aspects of her personal life. So when questions became more complicated, refusing to address them created an obvious contrast. Meghan disagreed with that interpretation. She emphasized that she had the right to decide what she wanted to share. Susanna did not dispute that right. Her argument was that Meghan could decline to answer, but the interviewer could still ask the question and explain why it was relevant. That distinction increased the tension. Meghan saw the repeated questions as pressure, while Susanna viewed them as necessary follow-ups. The interview was now moving away from promotion and toward a direct disagreement about transparency, privacy, and the responsibility of a public interview. The conversation became more sensitive when Susanna Reid turned to Meghan Markle's relationship with her father. It was a subject Meghan had discussed publicly before, but she made it clear that she did not want to revisit it during this interview. Susanna questioned that decision. Her argument was that the subject remained relevant because Meghan's family relationships had already become part of her public story. If she had previously spoken about the issue in interviews and documentaries, why was it now completely off-limits? Meghan maintained that she had said everything she wanted to say and that the situation was private. She also emphasized that she should be able to establish boundaries around personal matters. Susanna accepted that Meghan could choose not to provide details, but she questioned whether those boundaries were being applied consistently. She pointed to the contrast between Meghan's willingness to discuss difficult issues involving the royal family and her reluctance to discuss similar issues involving her own family. That comparison clearly frustrated Meghan. From Meghan's perspective, there was an important difference between sharing parts of her experience and being repeatedly questioned about a private relationship. Susanna, however, believed that the difference was worth examining because Meghan's public statements had already made the subject relevant to viewers. The exchange remained focused on the principle rather than personal attacks. Meghan wanted control over what she disclosed. Susanna wanted to understand why certain subjects were open for discussion while others were suddenly protected by privacy. The disagreement also established a pattern that would continue through the rest of the interview. Whenever Susanna moved toward a difficult subject, Meghan tried to redirect the conversation, while Susanna followed up. And that pattern would soon become even more noticeable when Harry entered the discussion. The tension continued when Susanna Reid asked Meghan Markle how Prince Harry was doing. On the surface, it was a straightforward question, especially given how closely their public and professional lives have been connected. Meghan, however, made it clear that she wanted the interview to remain focused on herself and her current work. She did not want to discuss Harry's personal situation. Susanna questioned that boundary. She pointed out that many of Meghan and Harry's major projects had been presented publicly as joint ventures. Their documentary, charitable work, and professional partnerships had often involved both of them. From that perspective, Susanna argued, asking about Harry was relevant to understanding Meghan's public life. Meghan disagreed. She emphasized that she had her own identity and that not every question about her had to include her husband. Susanna acknowledged that point but continued to question the distinction. If Meghan was comfortable discussing their shared projects when discussing her career, why should Harry suddenly become completely off-limits when the questions became more personal? Meghan appeared increasingly frustrated with the direction of the conversation. She felt that the interview was moving too far away from the subjects she had agreed to discuss. Susanna saw it differently. She believed she was following up on information that was already part of the couple's public profile. The disagreement was now becoming a pattern. Meghan wanted to decide which subjects remained private, while Susanna wanted to test those boundaries with additional questions. Neither side appeared willing to change position, and the conversation was becoming increasingly difficult to redirect. The next question would make that disagreement even more direct. The disagreement reached another level when Meghan Markle directly challenged the tone of Susanna Reid's questioning. Meghan suggested that the interview no longer felt like a normal conversation and instead felt hostile. Susanna did not respond by raising her voice. Instead, she asked Meghan to identify exactly which question had been hostile. That put the focus back on the interview itself. Susanna explained that she had asked about Britain's relationship with Meghan, her professional work, her business decisions, her family, and Harry. In her view, these were all subjects that could reasonably arise in a public interview. Meghan maintained that the repeated follow-up questions made the conversation feel confrontational. She believed she was being pushed to discuss subjects she had already decided were private. Susanna disagreed with the characterization. She argued that asking a difficult question was not the same as attacking a guest. An interviewer could challenge an answer without having a personal motive against the person being interviewed. Ed Balls attempted to keep the conversation from becoming more tense and suggested moving toward lighter subjects. But the disagreement had already become the main focus. Susanna continued to make the distinction clear. Meghan had every right to decline to answer a question, but that did not mean the question itself was inappropriate. Meghan appeared to see the repeated questioning as evidence that the interview was not being conducted in the way she expected. At this point, the two sides were no longer debating only Meghan's work or personal life. They were disagreeing over the basic purpose of an interview. And once that happened, the conversation became much harder to bring back to its original subject. The tension increased further when Meghan Markle compared Susanna Reid's questioning style with that of Piers Morgan. The comparison was significant because Morgan had previously been one of the most outspoken television critics of Meghan and had been involved in major public discussions surrounding her interviews. Susanna did not appear interested in turning the conversation into a debate about Piers Morgan. Instead, she focused on what the comparison meant. She explained that asking difficult questions was part of journalism. An interviewer could challenge a guest without necessarily being hostile toward them. From Susanna's perspective, refusing to accept an answer simply because it was uncomfortable was not the same as attacking the person giving it. Meghan continued to argue that the interview had become unfair and that the questioning had crossed a line. Susanna responded by pointing out that she had remained professional throughout the conversation. She had asked Meghan to explain statements, clarify decisions, and respond to subjects that were already part of her public life. The comparison with Piers therefore became another disagreement over the same basic issue: whether challenging questions should be treated as hostility. Ed Balls again attempted to keep the discussion from escalating, but the exchange had already become difficult to redirect. Susanna remained firm. She did not accept the idea that asking follow-up questions automatically made the interview hostile. For Meghan, however, the repeated challenges appeared to confirm that the conversation was no longer going in the direction she wanted. The disagreement had now reached a point where continuing the interview would require one side to change its approach. Neither seemed willing to do that. And that set the stage for the moment when Meghan decided to end the conversation. The interview reached its breaking point when Meghan Markle made it clear that she no longer wanted to continue. By this stage, the disagreement was no longer about one particular question. It was about the entire direction of the conversation. Susanna Reid continued to argue that she had asked reasonable questions about Meghan's work, family, relationship with Britain, and public life. Meghan maintained that the questioning had become too personal and that she had not come to the program to defend herself against repeated challenges. Susanna then questioned why Meghan had agreed to appear if she expected the interview to avoid difficult subjects. From Susanna's perspective, appearing on a program known for direct interviews meant accepting that some questions might not be comfortable. Meghan disagreed and decided to end the conversation. She gathered her things and left the interview area, bringing the discussion to an abrupt conclusion. Susanna remained composed rather than following her or attempting to continue the argument. Ed Balls appeared to recognize that there was little more he could do to change the situation. The interview that had begun as a discussion about Meghan's work had ended with the guest leaving because of a disagreement over the questions. For Susanna, the central issue remained simple. She believed she had been doing the job of an interviewer by asking follow-up questions and challenging answers that she felt were incomplete. For Meghan, the experience appeared very different. She believed the questioning had crossed the boundary between a difficult interview and an unfair one. The walk-off therefore became the clearest expression of the disagreement that had been building from the beginning. One side wanted direct answers. The other wanted greater control over which questions would be answered. And neither position changed before Meghan left. After Meghan Markle left the interview, attention quickly shifted from the subjects she had originally planned to discuss to the disagreement itself. The central question was no longer simply about her work. Viewers were now debating whether Susanna Reid had been appropriately persistent or whether the interview had gone too far. Susanna later explained her position clearly. She argued that Meghan had been given opportunities to discuss her work and explain her perspective, but that difficult questions were repeatedly treated as personal attacks. Ed Balls also acknowledged that he had tried to redirect the conversation toward more positive subjects. However, the disagreement over the questioning continued to dominate the interview. Meghan's side, meanwhile, could argue that she had the right to decide which parts of her personal life remained private. From that perspective, declining to answer a question did not necessarily mean avoiding accountability. It could simply mean maintaining a boundary. Susanna's position was different. She could ask the question even if Meghan chose not to answer it. In journalism, those are separate issues. That distinction became the main point of the aftermath. The interview also raised a broader question about celebrity interviews. When a public figure agrees to appear on television, how much control should they have over the direction of the conversation? And when does persistent questioning become unfair? There was no simple answer. For Susanna, the interview demonstrated why follow-up questions matter. For Meghan, it demonstrated why boundaries matter. What remained was an interview that had started as a professional discussion but ended with the guest walking away. And that final moment became the part most people remembered. In the end, the disagreement between Meghan Markle and Susanna Reid came down to one basic question. What should happen when a guest does not want to answer? Meghan wanted to control which parts of her personal and professional life were discussed. Susanna believed that asking difficult follow-up questions was part of her responsibility as an interviewer. Neither position is difficult to understand. Public figures have legitimate reasons for keeping some matters private. At the same time, journalists are expected to ask questions that may not always be comfortable, especially when those subjects have already been discussed publicly. That is what made the interview so difficult to watch. The disagreement was not simply about one question. It developed through a series of moments where Meghan felt increasingly challenged, while Susanna believed she was simply seeking clearer answers. Eventually, Meghan chose to end the conversation rather than continue under those conditions. So what do you think? Was Susanna Reid right to keep pressing for answers? Or should she have respected Meghan's decision to move away from certain subjects? And if you enjoy breakdowns of high-profile interviews and the moments that change the entire conversation, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for the next one.